The sailor's hands were shaking as he tied the mooring rope to Messina's dock. Not from the wind. Not from exhaustion after 3 weeks at sea. From fever. The kind that makes your bones feel like they're breaking from the inside. He'd watched 12 of his shipmates die during the voyage from Kaffa. Watched them develop black swellings the size of fists. Watched them scream as the buboes burst. Watched their bodies get thrown overboard because there was nowhere else to put them. And now he was in Messina.
Safe.
Finally safe.
Home.
He had no idea that in his ship's hold, between the bales of silk worth a merchant's fortune, hundreds of rats were stirring. Rats whose fleas carried Yersinia pestis. Rats that would disembark within hours and spread into Messina's warehouses and homes and markets. This sailor thought he'd survived. He had no idea he was patient zero for the pandemic that would kill half of Europe. October 1347. 12 Genoese merchant galleys arrived at Messina in northeastern Sicily. The ships were returning from Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, the western terminus of the Silk Road where European merchants traded for Asian luxuries. This was a routine voyage that happened dozens of times annually. Ships sailed from Italian ports to Kaffa. They loaded silk from China, spices from India, precious stones, gold, slaves. They sailed home through Constantinople, maybe stopping at Greek islands to trade. They returned to Italian ports, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and unloaded fortunes. The merchants made massive profits. The cities grew wealthy. The sailors earned wages that fed their families. Everyone benefited from this trade. It was the economic engine that made Italian maritime republics the richest entities in medieval Europe. But this voyage was different. Because the merchants and sailors didn't know what they were carrying. They knew they had silk. They knew they had spices. They could see and touch and smell and catalog their cargo. What they couldn't see was the rats hiding between the cargo bales. What they couldn't see was the fleas on those rats. What they couldn't see was the bacteria in those fleas. Yersinia pestis. The plague bacterium. The pathogen that would kill 200 million people over the next 6 years and transform human civilization forever. Before we follow these ships from Kaffa to Messina and watch how merchants unknowingly spread apocalypse, and trust me, we're going minute by minute, decision by decision, showing exactly how rational economic choices created catastrophic consequences, comment where you're from. Because what happened to Messina in October 1347 is happening to your city right now. Maybe not plague. Maybe COVID variants. Maybe the next pandemic that hasn't emerged yet. But the dynamic is identical. Global trade connects us and global trade endangers us. Comment your location. Let's map who understands that the ships are always arriving, always carrying things we can't see, always threatening pandemic. Let's see who gets it. The merchants who loaded cargo at Kaffa in September 1347 were experienced professionals. They'd made this voyage before, many times. They knew how to evaluate silk quality, how to negotiate spice prices, how to assess whether cargo was worth the investment and risk. They knew sailing routes, weather patterns, pirate-prone waters to avoid. They knew maritime law, commercial contracts, letter of credit systems that enabled long-distance trade. These were sophisticated businessmen operating in a complex global economy. They weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant. They were rational actors making informed decisions based on available information. And every decision they made was perfectly reasonable and completely catastrophic. Here's what they knew in September 1347. Kaffa was experiencing some kind of epidemic disease. People were dying. The Mongol army besieging the city was dying at even higher rates. The situation was deteriorating. The smart move was to leave before the situation got worse. Load whatever cargo could be gathered quickly. Get the ships loaded. Set sail for home before the disease, whatever it was, spread further. This was entirely rational. If you're a merchant in a city experiencing epidemic disease, you evacuate your assets and yourself. You don't stay and die. You leave. You save what can be saved. You return home where presumably the disease hasn't spread yet. Every merchant made this calculation. Every merchant reached the same conclusion. Leave now. And that decision killed millions. Here's what they didn't know. Disease was already on their ships. Not in their crews, though some sailors were probably infected before departure. In their cargo. In the rats hiding between silk bales. Medieval people had no concept of disease vectors. They didn't understand that animals could carry disease. They didn't understand that rats were particularly effective carriers because rats lived in close proximity to humans, and rat fleas would bite humans when rat hosts died. They didn't understand bacteria or infection or how epidemic diseases spread. Their medical theory was humoral medicine, the idea that disease resulted from imbalances in bodily fluids. Treatment involved bloodletting, purging, dietary adjustments, herbal remedies. None of which worked for plague because none of it addressed the actual cause. So when they loaded cargo in Kaffa's warehouses, they didn't notice the rats. Or they noticed rats, because warehouses always had rats. That was normal. Rats were unavoidable nuisances that ate grain and damaged goods, but they didn't connect rats to disease. Why would they? Rats had always been present in warehouses and ships and cities. Rats were part of urban life, like flies or pigeons or street dogs. Annoying but irrelevant to human health. The idea that rats carried plague, that fleas on rats transmitted bacteria to humans, that avoiding rats was an essential public health measure, these concepts wouldn't be discovered for another 500 years. The merchants loaded cargo containing rats and saw nothing wrong with this because they had no framework for understanding that they were loading death. The sailors who loaded cargo had similar blindness. They were experienced seamen who'd made this voyage many times. They knew how to load ships for stability, how to secure cargo against storms, how to maximize space utilization. They worked efficiently, moving bales and barrels and crates from warehouse to dock to ship's hold. And rats boarded during loading operations. Rats always boarded ships during loading because ships offered food and shelter, and rats are opportunistic colonizers of any suitable habitat. The sailors probably saw rats. Probably tried to kill some with sticks or dogs. Definitely didn't succeed in keeping all rats off the ships because preventing rat boarding was impossible with medieval technology. And even if they'd succeeded in killing every rat visible during loading, they couldn't have killed the rats hiding deep in cargo bales, the rats that had been living in warehouse silk for weeks, the rats that would emerge during the voyage. The ships departed Kaffa in mid-October 1347. 12 galleys, maybe 1,000 men total crew and passengers, unknown thousands of rats hidden in cargo holds. The voyage to Messina normally took 2 to 3 weeks depending on weather and wind. The route went west across the Black Sea to Constantinople, through the Bosporus into the Aegean, past the Greek islands, across the Ionian Sea to Sicily. Standard route that Genoese merchants had sailed for decades. Nothing unusual about this voyage. Except for the dying. Sailors started developing fever within days of departure. Maybe they'd been infected in Kaffa before boarding. Maybe they were infected during the voyage by fleas that came aboard with cargo. The chronology is unclear from surviving records. What's certain is that men were dying before the ships reached Constantinople. The captains faced horrible decisions. Sailor develops fever. Within a day, he's covered in swellings. Within 3 days, he's dead. What do you do with the body? Proper Christian burial requires stopping, conducting religious ceremony, burial in consecrated ground. But stopping wastes time and more men are getting sick. So they compromised. Throw the bodies overboard. Say prayers while doing it to satisfy religious requirements. Keep sailing toward home and safety. Every captain made this calculation. Every captain chose speed over ceremony. And that decision was rational given the information they had. They didn't know that the dying would continue regardless of how fast they sailed. They thought they were escaping plague. They were carrying it. Think about being a sailor on one of these ships. You signed up for a trading voyage to Kaffa. Standard work. Decent pay. Some risk from pirates or storms, but manageable. You loaded cargo. You set sail. And then your shipmates started dying. Not from normal ship hazards like falling from rigging or getting crushed by shifting cargo. From disease that makes them scream and bleed and rot while still alive. 1 dies. Then 2. Then 5. Then a dozen. The captain says keep working, keep sailing, we'll reach safety soon. You believe him because what choice do you have? You can't abandon ship in the middle of the Mediterranean. You can't turn around and go back to Kaffa, which is experiencing the same disease at even worse levels. You can only sail forward toward Messina and hope you're one of the lucky ones who doesn't get sick. Some sailors were lucky. Most weren't. By the time the fleet reached Messina, perhaps half the original crews were dead and half the survivors showed symptoms. Now here's the crucial detail that explains how merchants unknowingly spread plague. Comment below. Do you think they knew? Do you think when the ships arrived at Messina with half the crew dead, the merchants and captains understood they were carrying plague? Drop your opinion. Because the answer reveals something important about human psychology and pandemic response. Here's what I think. They knew they'd experienced epidemic disease. They knew many men had died. They didn't know they were still carrying the disease in cargo holds. They thought that because some sailors had survived, because the ships had reached Messina, they'd escaped. The dying was over. The danger had passed. They'd made it to safety. This was completely wrong. But it was reasonable given what they knew. And that's terrifying. Because we make the same mistakes today. The ships docked at Messina in late October 1347. The harbor authorities probably inspected them. Probably noticed the reduced crew sizes and asked what happened. The captains probably explained, "We experienced epidemic disease in Kaffa and during the voyage. Many men died. We threw the bodies overboard. The survivors are here. We request permission to unload cargo and disembark." What should the harbor authorities have done? In retrospect, obviously, refuse entry. Burn the ships. Quarantine survivors. Prevent any contact between ship and shore. But they didn't do that. They allowed the ships to dock. They allowed cargo unloading. They allowed crew disembarkation. Why? Because trade was essential to Messina's economy. Because the cargo was valuable and merchants would sue the city if their goods were destroyed. Because the sailors needed medical care that could only be provided on shore. Because refusing entry meant those ships would go to competing ports and Messina would lose trade revenue. Economic pressure overcame caution. The ships were allowed to dock. And plague entered Messina. The cargo unloading took days. Stevedores worked to move bales of silk from ship's hold to dock to warehouse. They handled cargo that had been sitting with rats for weeks. They breathed air filled with flea-contaminated dust. They created disturbances that drove rats from cargo holds to shore looking for new territory. The rats that had been confined to ship holds during the voyage now had access to Messina's entire city. And they used it. Rats are extraordinarily good at exploiting urban environments. They're intelligent enough to learn routes, cautious enough to avoid traps, adaptable enough to eat almost anything, prolific enough to breed rapidly when conditions favor reproduction. Within days of cargo unloading, Messina's rat population had been infiltrated by plague-infected rats from Kaffa. Within weeks, Messina's human population started dying. The first victims were probably stevedores and warehouse workers who'd handled cargo directly. They developed fever. They developed buboes in groin and armpits. They died within days. Their families caught plague from fleas that abandoned cooling corpses. Their neighbors caught plague from fleas spreading through tenement buildings. The disease spread exponentially through Messina's densely packed port district. The contemporary chronicler Michel de Piazza, writing from first-hand observation, described apocalyptic scenes. He wrote that victims died so quickly that the living couldn't keep up with burying the dead. He wrote that entire families died within days of each other. He wrote that people fled Messina in terror, carrying plague to other Sicilian cities, spreading the disease across the island within weeks. He claimed 3/4 of Sicily's population died, though modern historians estimate 1/3 to 1/2 is more accurate. Even at the lower estimate, that's 300,000 to 400,000 deaths on a single island from plague introduced by 12 merchant ships. The merchants who survived, and some did survive, plague mortality was 60 to 90% but not 100%, probably had no idea what they'd done. They'd brought valuable cargo to Messina. They'd completed a profitable trading voyage. They'd escaped Kaffa's epidemic. They'd done everything right from a commercial perspective. How could they know that rats in their cargo holds had spread plague to Messina? They couldn't see the rats carrying the disease. They couldn't see the fleas transmitting bacteria. They couldn't connect their ship's arrival to the epidemic that erupted weeks later. Medieval people simply didn't have the conceptual framework to understand vector-borne disease transmission. The connection between their ships and Messina's plague epidemic would have seemed like coincidental bad luck, not causation. Some ships from the Caffa fleet didn't stop at Messina. They continued to Genoa, Venice, Marseille, other Italian and French ports. Each ship carried the same cargo. Each ship carried rats. Each ship seeded plague outbreaks at its destination. Genoa was infected by ships from Caffa arriving in January 1348. Venice was infected simultaneously. Marseille was infected when a ship expelled from Italian ports arrived in late January 1348. The pattern was identical everywhere. Ships arrived. Cargo was unloaded. Rats disembarked. Fleas spread. Humans died. The merchants made their profits. The cities collected their tariffs. Everyone thought trade was proceeding normally. Nobody realized that the ships themselves were vectors spreading plague across the Mediterranean faster than any land-based transmission could. Let me ask you again because this is critical. Do you think the merchants knew? Do you think they understood what they were carrying? Comment your answer. They knew, or they didn't know. And explain why. Because this question matters today just as much as it mattered in 1347. We have ships arriving at ports constantly. Container ships from China. Oil tankers from the Middle East. Cargo planes from everywhere. Each one could be carrying the next pandemic. And the people operating those ships, captains, crew, merchants, port authorities, they're making the same calculations medieval merchants made. Maximize profit. Minimize delay. Assume the cargo is safe unless there's obvious evidence otherwise. And if pandemic does spread, how much do they know? How much should they have known? How much are they responsible? Your answer to the medieval question reveals your answer to the modern question. Here's what makes this story devastating. The merchants were doing everything right according to their world's knowledge and standards. They were experienced professionals making informed decisions. They evaluated risks correctly. Stay in plague-infected Caffa or flee to safety. They executed their evacuation efficiently, load cargo quickly, set sail immediately, minimize time in danger zone. They dealt with in-voyage plague deaths reasonably, maintained sailing speed toward safety, accept casualties as unavoidable, focus on getting survivors home. They followed all protocols when arriving at Messina, report casualties, request entry, submit to inspection. At every decision point, they did what reasonable professionals would do. And they spread plague to Sicily that killed hundreds of thousands. The horror isn't that they were stupid or evil or negligent. The horror is that they were competent and rational and still caused catastrophe. Because the system was broken at a level they couldn't perceive. The system was broken because maritime trade in 1347 had no mechanisms for preventing disease spread via cargo. Ships carried goods and ships carried rats and nobody understood the connection. Quarantine didn't exist yet. The concept of isolating potentially infected people or goods to prevent disease spread wouldn't be invented until plague had already devastated Europe. Venice would develop the first quarantine system in the 1370s, requiring ships from infected areas to anchor offshore for 40 days before cargo unloading. But in 1347, quarantine didn't exist. Ships docked freely. Cargo unloaded immediately. Trade proceeded without health precautions because health precautions hadn't been invented. Even if quarantine had existed, it wouldn't have worked without understanding disease vectors. You can quarantine crew members. You can quarantine passengers. You can't effectively quarantine rats you don't know are carrying disease. Medieval quarantine focused on keeping sick people away from healthy people. But plague's primary transmission route was rat-to-human via fleas, not human-to-human. Quarantining sick sailors while allowing cargo unloading would have been ineffective because cargo contained the vectors. The merchants and port authorities would need to understand that rats carried plague, that fleas transmitted bacteria, that cargo needed fumigation or destruction, that ships needed rat extermination before cargo unloading. They understood none of this. So even their best efforts at disease prevention would have failed because those efforts targeted the wrong transmission routes. Now watch what happened after Messina. Because plague spread from Sicily to the Italian mainland following the same pattern. Merchants fled plague-infected Messina. They loaded their ships with whatever goods they'd already purchased in Messina before plague arrived. They sailed to Genoa, Venice, Pisa, seeking safety and new markets. And they carried plague with them. Not necessarily because the merchants themselves were infected, though some probably were and died during transit or shortly after arrival. Because their cargo contained rats. The same dynamic that brought plague from Caffa to Messina now brought plague from Messina to Genoa. From Genoa to Venice. From Venice to Pisa. Each merchant thought they were fleeing plague. Each merchant was carrying it. The Venetian response illustrates how sophisticated medieval trade systems were and how those sophisticated systems completely failed to prevent plague spread. Venice had extensive trade networks throughout the Mediterranean. Venetian merchants operated from Syria to Spain, from Constantinople to London. The city's government monitored trade carefully, collecting detailed information about goods, prices, shipping routes, commercial conditions. When plague reached Venice in January 1348, authorities knew immediately because Venice had sophisticated information systems. They knew plague had come from ships arriving from infected ports. They imposed travel restrictions. They banned ships from infected areas. They quarantined new arrivals. They implemented every disease control measure their knowledge allowed. Plague spread through Venice anyway because their measures couldn't stop rat-mediated transmission. Venice lost perhaps half its population, 50,000 deaths out of 100,000 residents. The sophisticated commercial republic with advanced governance and extensive information networks couldn't prevent plague from destroying half its population because their disease model was wrong at a fundamental level. Florence experienced the same pattern. Plague arrived via ships from Pisa in March 1348. Florentine authorities knew plague was spreading through Italy. They tried to prevent infected people from entering the city. They quarantined travelers from infected areas. They banned import of goods from plague zones. Plague spread through Florence anyway, killing 50 to 60,000 of 120,000 residents. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived and wrote the Decameron during Florence's plague years, described the futility of precautions. He wrote that people tried everything to avoid infection, fleeing the city, isolating in their homes, only associating with healthy people, consuming moderate diets, avoiding excess. Some survived. Most didn't. Boccaccio noted that survival seemed random, unconnected to precautions taken. He was right. Precautions targeting human-to-human transmission had limited effectiveness when transmission was primarily rat-to-human. You could isolate from sick people. You couldn't isolate from rats that lived in your walls. The merchants who brought plague to these cities probably never knew their role. They'd fled Messina or Caffa or Constantinople seeking safety. They'd sailed to new markets. They'd sold their goods for profit. Weeks later, plague erupted in the cities where they'd traded. Was there a connection? Maybe. Maybe not. Medieval people lacked the epidemiological tools to trace disease spread back to index cases. They couldn't connect ship arrivals to disease outbreaks weeks later because the lag time obscured causation. They couldn't identify specific cargo as contaminated because they couldn't see bacteria or test for pathogens. They just knew that plague was spreading, that people were dying, that their world was ending. And they didn't know why. The ignorance was comprehensive and tragic. Now here's the second question I want you to answer in comments. If you were a merchant in 1347 and you understood that your cargo might be carrying plague, would you still trade? Would you still load cargo in plague-infected Caffa and sail to Messina knowing you might spread disease? Comment, yes, I'd trade, or, no, I wouldn't trade, and explain why. Because your answer reveals your values. It reveals whether you'd prioritize personal profit or public health. It reveals whether you'd accept pandemic risk as the price of commerce. And your answer to the medieval question predicts your answer to modern questions about global trade and pandemic risk. Think carefully. Then comment. Here's what I think most merchants would have done if they'd understood disease transmission. Traded anyway. Not because they were evil. Because the economics were overwhelming. A successful voyage to Caffa could make a merchant wealthy for years. The profit margins on silk and spices were enormous. Buy in Caffa for prices X. Sell in Genoa for prices 5x or 10x. A single successful voyage could set up a merchant's family financially. Refusing to trade meant refusing that opportunity. Refusing meant competitors who did trade would capture the profits. Refusing meant economic disadvantage in intensely competitive markets. So merchants would have accepted the pandemic risk, rationalized it as low probability or acceptable cost, and traded anyway. Just like modern corporations accept pandemic risk as the price of global supply chains. Just like modern consumers accept pandemic risk as the price of cheap goods. Just like modern governments accept pandemic risk as the price of economic growth. The calculation hasn't changed in 7 centuries. The ships kept arriving. Throughout 1348 and 1349 and 1350, merchant ships continued sailing between Mediterranean ports. Trade didn't stop even as plague killed millions. It slowed, fewer ships, fewer merchants, fewer goods. But it continued. Because people needed food that came from other regions. Because cities needed grain imports to survive. Because merchants needed income to feed their families. Because trade was essential to survival even if trade spread plague. The system couldn't be stopped without causing economic collapse that would kill as many people as plague killed. So the ships kept sailing. The rats kept boarding. The fleas kept transmitting. The plague kept spreading. And the merchants kept believing they were just doing business. Some merchants learned. By 1349, some Italian merchants refused to trade with plague-infected areas regardless of profit potential. Some cities banned ships from infected zones regardless of economic cost. Venice's quarantine system, invented in the 1370s, showed that some lessons were absorbed. But by then, plague had already killed 50 million Europeans. The learning came too late for the first pandemic wave. The knowledge was purchased with millions of lives. And even after learning, the fundamental dynamic remained. Trade spreads disease, and we accept that risk because we need trade more than we fear disease. Until disease kills millions. Then we implement temporary precautions until the epidemic passes. Then we resume trade and forget the lessons until the next pandemic arrives. One more call to action before we finish. Comment, "Black ships," if you're still here. And tell me, which merchant story should I tell? The Genoese captain who brought plague from Caffa to Messina? The Venetian trader who survived plague in Constantinople and brought it home? The Florentine merchant who fled Pisa's plague and seeded Florence's epidemic? I'll make a follow-up about whichever gets the most requests. Comment the role plus "Black ships" so I can count votes. The title calls them the Black Ships. Black because death followed them. Black because corpses lined their decks. Black because they turned Mediterranean trade routes into highways of death. But the ships weren't evil. The ships were tools used by people who didn't understand what they were doing. The merchants weren't villains. They were businessmen making rational economic decisions based on available information. The sailors weren't accomplices. They were workers earning wages to feed families. The rats weren't malevolent. They were animals following evolutionary programming to exploit human environments. The fleas weren't intentional disease vectors. They were parasites trying to survive. The bacteria weren't sentient evil. They were microorganisms reproducing in suitable hosts. Nobody involved in this catastrophe intended mass death. But 200 million people died anyway because the system, the global trade system, was perfectly designed to spread pandemic disease, and nobody understood this until millions had died. We're running the same system today. Global trade is vastly more extensive than medieval commerce. Container ships move millions of tons of cargo annually. Air freight moves goods across continents in hours. Supply chains connect every manufacturing center to every consumer market. The system is optimized for efficiency and profit. It's not optimized for pandemic prevention. We still don't inspect cargo for disease vectors effectively. We still allow ships to dock and unload with minimal health screening. We still accept that trade will spread disease because accepting that risk is cheaper than implementing comprehensive prevention. COVID-19 spread globally in weeks via air travel. The next pandemic will spread even faster because the system gets more connected and more efficient every year. And we'll respond the same way medieval merchants responded. Implement temporary restrictions. Contain the outbreak. Resume trade. Forget the lessons. Until next time. The rats are still boarding ships. Different species, Brown rats now instead of black rats, but same behavior. Cargo holds still provide ideal habitat. International trade still moves rats between continents. Invasive rat species colonize new territories via shipping routes. The mechanism that spread plague in 1347 still operates in 2025. We've added fumigation and pest control and port inspections. But we haven't eliminated the fundamental vulnerability. Ships carry cargo. Cargo attracts rats. Rats carry diseases. Some of those diseases are dangerous to humans. We know this. We accept it. Because stopping it would require stopping global trade, and we need trade more than we fear rats. The next pandemic might not be plague. Might be something worse. Might be something engineered to be worse. Might be something that evolves naturally to be worse. Might arrive on a container ship from Asia. Might arrive on a cruise ship from the Caribbean. Might arrive on a cargo plane from Africa. We won't know until people start dying. And when people start dying, we'll trace transmission routes backward, trying to find the index case, trying to understand where it came from and how it spread. And we'll probably find that it arrived on a ship. That merchants brought it unknowingly. That cargo workers spread it unintentionally. That the system designed for profit facilitated pandemic. Just like 1347. Just like always. The merchants didn't know they were carrying death. That's the title. That's the truth. They knew they had silk and spices and gold. They couldn't see the rats and fleas and bacteria. They were doing their jobs. They were making rational decisions. They were participating in a global economy that enriched everyone connected to it. And they killed 200 million people. Not through malice. Through ignorance. Through systemic failure. Through the inevitable consequences of systems optimized for commerce without regard for public health consequences. The black ships arrived in October 1347. They're still arriving. Different ships, different cargo, different diseases. But same dynamic. Same vulnerability. Same inevitable catastrophe waiting to happen. We know the ships are coming. We know they carry things we can't see. We know pandemic is always arriving. We keep allowing the ships to dock anyway. Because we need what they carry. Because we profit from trade. Because we accept pandemic risk as the price of prosperity. The black ships are always arriving. We're always allowing them to dock. We're always unloading death without knowing it. Until millions die. Until we learn. Until we forget. Forever. The merchants thought they'd escaped. They were wrong. They just spread the catastrophe further. And we're doing the same thing right now. The black ships are in harbor. The cargo is being unloaded. The rats are disembarking. We can't see what they're carrying. But it's coming. It's always coming. The ships make sure of that.